Struggling artist donated painting to charity auction. Buyer was a famed critic who launched her career. The words echoed in Emma's mind as she stared at the newspaper headline, fingers trembling against the thin paper. It seemed surreal, like someone else's story, not the narrative of her own transformation from obscurity to emerging artist over these past breathtaking months. The cramped studio apartment felt particularly cold that December morning. Emma Reeves huddled near the small space heater, its orange coils providing the only warmth in a room where her breath still clouded in the air. Outside, Chicago's notorious winter howled against her windows, but inside was another kind of winter altogether, the kind that had settled in her heart years ago and refused to thaw. At 32, Emma had long stopped telling people she was an artist. "I work retail," she'd say instead, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. The truth was there in the cramped corners of her apartment. Canvases stacked against walls, brushes in chipped mugs, the smell of linseed oil and turpentine permanently embedded in the worn floorboards. She painted in the hours between sleep and her shift at the bookstore, creating worlds no one else would see. Her latest piece leaned against the wall, a 30 by 40 canvas she'd been working on for months. Unlike her usual abstract compositions, this one was intensely personal. A woman standing at the edge of a vast, churning sea, her back to the viewer, red hair whipping in an unseen wind. The horizon line blurred between storm and possibility. Emma had titled it "The Edge of Everything." In her mind, though she'd never bothered to write it down, what was the point of naming something no one would ever ask about? The eviction notice had arrived yesterday, her third in as many months. The bookstore had cut her hours again. Something had to give. When her phone rang, Emma almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and she'd grown tired of debt collectors. But some small, stubborn spark made her reach for it. "Emma Reeves? This is Diane from Hope House Foundation. You donated art supplies to our children's program last summer?" Emma pressed the phone closer. "Yes, I remember. We're holding a charity auction next week. One of our major donors backed out of providing a piece for the silent auction. I know it's last minute, but I remembered your work. Would you consider donating a painting?" Emma's eyes drifted to "The Edge of Everything," the only piece she'd ever made that felt truly, rawly honest. The painting that contained everything she couldn't say aloud. Her voice caught. "I don't really have anything suitable. Anything would help us, truly. The funds go directly to our shelter programs." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of the radiator's irregular clicking. "I'll bring something by tomorrow," Emma finally said, not knowing why she was agreeing, only that saying no seemed impossible. After hanging up, she approached the painting, running her fingers along the textured edge of the canvas. Parting with it felt like surrendering a piece of herself, but perhaps that was fitting. She was at the edge of everything, too, the edge of giving up on art altogether. The next day, Emma wrapped the canvas carefully in brown paper and made the long bus ride to Hope House. The cold bit through her threadbare coat, numbing her fingers and toes. By the time she arrived, her cheeks were raw and stinging. "Oh, this is lovely," Diane breathed when Emma unwrapped the painting. "Truly, Emma, I wish we could pay you what it's worth." Emma smiled tightly. "It's a donation. Just put a $20 minimum bid on it or something. We'll make sure it finds a good home," Diane promised, handling the canvas with reverence that made Emma's chest ache. Walking back to the bus stop, Emma felt strangely lightened, as if she'd set down something heavy she'd been carrying too long. Maybe this was how it ended, not with a dramatic declaration or a ceremonial burning of brushes, but with the quiet surrender of her most honest work to a charity auction where it would likely sell for less than the cost of materials. There was poetry in that, she supposed. The night of the auction, Emma stayed home. She sat cross-legged on her floor, surrounded by bills she couldn't pay, sketching mindlessly on a pad, something she hadn't done in years. Just drawing for the pleasure of the pencil against paper, with no expectations. It felt like remembering how to breathe. She didn't check her phone until morning. 3 missed calls from Diane and a voicemail. "Emma, call me as soon as you get this. Your painting. You won't believe what happened. Please call back." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she returned the call. "There you are," Diane exclaimed. "Emma, your painting sold for $12,000. The room tilted slightly. There must be some mistake." "No mistake. There was a bidding war. The buyer was quite determined. He's left his card for you. Says he wants to meet the artist." Numbness spread from Emma's fingertips through her entire body. Who bought it?" "James Harrington. The name hit her like physical force. Anyone who knew anything about the art world knew James Harrington, the critic whose reviews could make or destroy careers, whose gallery showings were exclusive events, whose opinion was valued above almost all others. "He wants to meet me?" Emma whispered. "He was quite insistent," Diane confirmed. "Said he'd be at his gallery tomorrow at 2 p.m. if you'd like to stop by. No pressure, but I'll be there," Emma said, her voice strange in her own ears. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She ransacked her closet for something presentable, ironed her least wrinkled shirt, and spent hours online reading everything she could find about James Harrington. His critiques were legendary, sharp, uncompromising, occasionally brutal. In a review from last year, he'd written of a well-established artist, technically proficient but spiritually bankrupt. One might as well stare at wallpaper for all the emotional depth conveyed. By morning, Emma was a bundle of frayed nerves. She rehearsed what she might say, then decided to say nothing at all. What could she possibly offer that would interest someone like him? Perhaps he'd bought her painting as an example of what not to do, a teaching tool for his critical writing. The Harrington Gallery occupied a converted warehouse in the West Loop. Its imposing facade of steel and glass made Emma pause on the sidewalk, her reflection distorted in the tinted windows. She wore her only good outfit: black pants, a navy blouse, and a borrowed coat from her coworker that was slightly too large. Her red hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing the sharp angles of her face. The gallery assistant looked up as Emma entered, taking in her nervous posture with a practiced eye. "Can I help you? I'm Emma Reeves. I have an appointment with Mr. Harrington." Recognition flickered across the woman's face. "Of course. He's expecting you. Please follow me." Emma was led through the main gallery space, all white walls and polished concrete floors, currently displaying large-scale black and white photographs, to a door at the back. The assistant knocked once, then opened it. "Ms. Reeves is here, Mr. Harrington." The office beyond was unexpectedly warm, walls lined with books, a worn leather sofa, artwork hung salon-style from floor to ceiling. Behind a massive oak desk sat James Harrington, smaller in person than Emma had imagined, with silver-streaked dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked up from his computer, and Emma was struck by the intensity of his gaze, like being seen through rather than merely seen. "Ms. Reeves." He stood, extending a hand. "I'm delighted you could come." His handshake was firm, his palm dry and warm against her cold fingers. Emma noticed the paint embedded in the creases of his knuckles, unexpected evidence that he was not merely a critic, but perhaps an artist himself. "Please sit." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Would you like tea? Coffee?" "No, thank you," Emma managed, perching on the edge of the seat. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Harrington studied her for a moment, then turned slightly. On the wall behind him hung "The Edge of Everything." "Your painting," he said simply. "It's extraordinary." Emma stared at her work, seeing it anew in this setting, professionally lit, properly framed, its colors more vibrant than she remembered. She hadn't realized how much of herself she'd poured into it until seeing it displayed like this, with someone else's appreciative eyes upon it. "You overpaid," she blurted out, immediately regretting the words. To her surprise, Harrington laughed, a genuine, warm sound. "On the contrary, if anything, I underpaid significantly." He leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Ms. Reeves." "Emma, please." "Emma. I've been a critic for over 30 years. I've written reviews of thousands of exhibitions, advised collectors, curated shows. And in all that time, I've rarely encountered work that stopped me in my tracks the way yours did." He gestured toward the painting. "There's something in this piece. A raw honesty, a technical skill in service to genuine emotion rather than mere demonstration of ability. It's the work of someone with something to say." Emma's throat tightened. She stared at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I'd like to see more," he said simply. "There isn't much more," Emma admitted. "I work retail. I paint when I can." "But you have other pieces?" She nodded reluctantly. "Nothing as recent. Nothing as good. I'd like to see them anyway. All of them." He pulled a business card from a holder on his desk and wrote something on the back. "My personal number. I'd like to visit your studio if you're amenable." Emma almost laughed at the idea of her cramped apartment being called a studio. "It's just my apartment." "It's not all the better," he interrupted gently. "I want to see where this came from." He tapped the painting. "Where you work, how you work? If that's not too intrusive." The surreality of the moment washed over Emma. James Harrington wanted to see her work. James Harrington thought she had talent. Why? She asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Why me? Why this painting? Harrington removed his glasses, cleaning them methodically with a cloth from his desk drawer. The gesture gave Emma a moment to notice the fine lines around his eyes, the weariness beneath his professional demeanor. 20 years ago, he said finally, replacing his glasses, I stopped painting. I had some success as an artist in my youth, but I found I could make a better living critiquing the work of others than creating my own. Over time, I became known for my critical eye rather than my creative one. He paused. What I didn't anticipate was how that transition would affect me, how seeing without making would gradually drain something essential from my perspective. He looked at Emma's painting again. When I saw your work last night, I recognized something I've been missing, not just in the art I review, but in myself. A willingness to stand at the edge of everything and face it honestly. His eyes returned to Emma. I'd like to help you if you'll allow it. Not just because your work deserves to be seen, but selfishly, because I think you might remind me of something I've forgotten. The vulnerability in his admission caught Emma off guard. This wasn't the calculating art world power broker she'd imagined, but a man who seemed to be offering a genuine connection, an artistic dialogue. I could come by tomorrow, she found herself saying. Around noon? Something that might have been relief crossed his face. Tomorrow at noon would be perfect. The night before Harrington's visit, Emma couldn't sleep. She paced her small apartment, alternating between frantic cleaning and pulling out old canvases, examining them with newly critical eyes. Most were abstract compositions, explorations of color and texture that had helped her process emotions she couldn't verbalize. A few were figurative pieces, studies of solitary people in urban environments. Looking at them chronologically revealed patterns even she hadn't noticed, her increasing isolation, her retreat into smaller expressions, safer statements. By morning, she had arranged 24 paintings against the walls of her apartment, a makeshift gallery of her private evolution. The space heater hummed ineffectively against the December chill. Emma made coffee, then changed her shirt 3 times before settling on a simple gray sweater. She tucked her hair behind her ears, decided against makeup, then applied a little anyway. Nothing felt right. At precisely noon, there was a knock at her door. James Harrington stood in the hallway, snow melting on the shoulders of his camel overcoat. He carried a bakery box in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other. I hope you don't mind, he said, offering the box. I never visit an artist's studio empty-handed. Inside were almond croissants from a French bakery Emma had passed countless times but never entered, their prices well beyond her budget. The gesture was so unexpected that she laughed, the sound breaking some of the tension that had been building all morning. Thank you, she said, genuinely touched. Please come in. If Harrington noticed the apartment's shabbiness, the water stain in one corner, the mismatched furniture, the kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, he gave no indication. His attention was immediately drawn to the paintings she'd arranged, and he moved toward them with quiet focus, setting down his portfolio to free his hands. Emma stood awkwardly by the door, unsure whether to follow or give him space. She settled for making tea, the familiar ritual steadying her nerves as she watched him from the kitchenette. Harrington moved methodically from one painting to the next, occasionally leaning in to examine a textural detail or stepping back to consider the composition. He didn't speak, but his engagement was palpable. He was truly seeing her work, not merely looking at it. Emma found herself holding her breath, studying his reactions for any hint of judgment. When he finally turned to her, his expression was unreadable. How long have you been painting? Since I was a child, Emma said, bringing him a mug of tea. Seriously, since college. And you studied where? Community college, then 2 years at the Art Institute before I had to drop out. Couldn't afford to finish? He nodded, accepting the tea with a murmured thanks. And since then? Emma gestured vaguely at the apartment. This. Working jobs that pay the rent, painting when I can. Applying for shows sometimes, but she trailed off, not wanting to catalog her rejections. These earlier works, he said, indicating a series of large, abstract pieces from her art school days. They're technically accomplished. Strong composition, good understanding of color theory. He sipped his tea. But these more recent ones? He moved toward the smaller, more emotionally raw paintings she'd done in the past year. These are where you found your voice. Emma stared at him, startled by the accuracy of his assessment. Those recent paintings were created during her darkest periods, when rent was overdue, when her mother's illness had worsened, when she'd begun to believe she had nothing worth saying. They were private expressions, never intended for other eyes. The painting I purchased, Harrington continued, it's a culmination of this evolution. The technical skill of your earlier work combined with the emotional honesty of these latest pieces. He turned to face her fully. Why did you donate it to charity? The directness of the question caught her off guard. Emma wrapped her hands around her mug, absorbing its warmth. I was giving up, she admitted quietly. That painting was the last thing I thought I'd ever make. It seemed fitting to let it go. Harrington was silent for a long moment. May I show you something? He asked, reaching for the portfolio he'd brought. Emma nodded, curious despite her nervousness. From the portfolio, he removed several pieces of paper, reviews he'd written, exhibition catalogs, and finally, a photograph of a painting. He handed the photo to Emma. This was mine, he said. The last painting I completed before I stopped making art. The image showed a large canvas dominated by a solitary figure on a stark white background. A man turned away from the viewer, his posture suggesting both defiance and defeat. The brushwork was bold, the emotion undeniable. It's beautiful, Emma said honestly. Why did you stop? Harrington set his mug down, rubbing a hand across his jaw. Fear, mostly. Fear disguised as pragmatism. I was beginning to get attention, which meant expectations. Critics, people like I eventually became, were starting to notice my work. I told myself I was making a strategic career move, leveraging my understanding of art without the vulnerability of creating it. His smile was rueful. The truth was, I was terrified of failing, of making something mediocre after making something good. So I stepped away, became the judge rather than the judged. The confession hung in the air between them. Emma recognized in his words the same fear that had been gradually silencing her own creative voice. And now? She asked. Now I'm a successful critic who hasn't made art in 2 decades, he said simply. I've helped launch careers, written definitive analyses of important works, amassed a respectable collection. But when I saw your painting at that auction, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I recognize myself in it, not the critic I've become, but the artist I walked away from being. Emma felt a strange kinship with this man who should have been so different from her, successful where she had struggled, established where she was unknown. Yet they shared something essential, the war between creating honestly and protecting oneself from the vulnerability that such honesty demanded. I have a proposition for you, Harrington said, straightening slightly. I'd like to curate a show of your work. A small exhibition at my gallery, featuring these recent paintings and any new work you create over the next 6 months. Emma stared at him, certain she'd misheard. You want to show my paintings? At your gallery? Yes. No hesitation, no qualification. You have a unique voice, Emma. It deserves to be heard. But I'm nobody, she protested. I haven't shown anywhere that matters. I don't have a degree or connections or none of that is relevant. He interrupted gently. Art isn't about credentials or connections. It's about truth. Your work speaks truth in a way that's increasingly rare. He gestured toward her paintings. These deserve to be seen. Emma's mind raced with objections, with all the practical reasons why this couldn't possibly work. I have a job. I can't just... You'll be paid in advance against sales, Harrington said. Enough to give you time to create. And I'll cover all exhibition costs, of course. Why would you do this for a stranger? The question came out more suspicious than she'd intended. Harrington didn't seem offended. Not entirely altruistic, I assure you. Your work will bring something fresh to my gallery. My collectors are always looking for new talent. He paused. And perhaps selfishly, I'd like to remember what it feels like to be part of creating something meaningful, even if only by providing the opportunity. Emma's gaze drifted to the eviction notice still pinned to her refrigerator door. She thought of the double shift she was scheduled to work tomorrow, the student loans she could barely make minimum payments on, the years of putting art second to survival. I'd need to keep my job at least part-time, she said slowly, hardly believing she was considering this. Of course, whatever you're comfortable with, we can work around your schedule. He pulled out another business card, writing on it. Here's what I propose as an advance. If that seems fair, we can draw up a formal agreement. Emma looked at the number he'd written and felt her knees weaken slightly. It was more money than she made in 4 months at the bookstore. It's too much, she stammered. It's standard for an artist of your caliber, Harrington replied calmly. I expect the work you'll produce will be worth considerably more. The confidence in his assessment, so at odds with her own perception of her worth, was disorienting. Emma felt as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, terrified to jump, yet knowing that remaining where she was had become impossible. "Okay," she whispered, then with more conviction, "Yes, thank you." Harrington smiled, a genuine expression that softened his academic demeanor. "Thank you, Emma, for trusting me with your work." He held out his hand. As she shook it, Emma felt something shift inside her, a door opening to a possibility she'd almost stopped believing in. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. With the advance from Harrington, Emma was able to pay her overdue rent, negotiate reduced hours at the bookstore, and most importantly, purchase proper supplies, quality canvases, professional-grade paints, new brushes that didn't shed bristles with every stroke. Harrington proved to be as good as his word. He arranged for a small studio space in the building adjacent to his gallery, a vast improvement over her apartment, with north-facing windows that bathed the room in perfect indirect light. He visited weekly, bringing coffee and sometimes lunch, sitting quietly while Emma worked or engaging her in conversations about art history, technique, or the Chicago art scene. Their relationship evolved into something Emma couldn't quite name, not quite friendship, more than a business arrangement. Harrington never imposed his own aesthetic judgments on her work in progress. Instead, he asked questions that helped Emma clarify her own intentions, pushing her to articulate what she was trying to accomplish. "I don't want to influence your voice," he explained one afternoon, watching as she worked on a large canvas. "That's the quickest way to destroy what makes your work special. My role is to help you hear yourself more clearly." As winter deepened into the brutal heart of January, Emma found herself painting with an intensity she hadn't experienced in years. The financial pressure temporarily lifted. She allowed herself to experiment, to take risks, to engage with larger canvases and more complex emotional terrain. She began a series exploring moments of human connection in urban isolation, strangers making fleeting contact on subway platforms, across coffee shops, through apartment windows. Each painting contained both the alienation of city life and the possibility of its transcendence. On a particularly frigid Tuesday, Harrington arrived at the studio looking unusually somber. Emma was deep in work, music playing through her headphones, and didn't notice him until he was standing at her elbow. She jumped slightly, removing her headphones. "Sorry," she said, wiping her paint-stained hands on her jeans. "I was in the zone." Harrington nodded, but his customary warmth seemed dimmed. "The work is progressing well," he observed, studying the large canvas before her. Two figures passing on a rain-slicked street, their reflected images meeting in a puddle between them. "It's getting there," Emma agreed. "Something's bothering you?" He seemed surprised by her directness, then smiled faintly. "I've become transparent in my old age." "Not old," Emma corrected automatically. "Just readable." That earned a genuine laugh. "Fair enough." He moved to the studio's small seating area, two armchairs salvaged from a thrift store, separated by a wooden crate that served as a coffee table. "I received some news this morning that's complicated." Emma followed him, curious. In their weeks of working together, Harrington had never shared personal concerns. "The Whitney is organizing a retrospective," he said once they were seated, "of critical voices who shaped American art discourse over the past half-century." "That's wonderful," Emma exclaimed. "You're being recognized for your work." Harrington's expression remained troubled. "Yes, but they're requesting something unexpected. They want to include some of my early paintings to illustrate my transition from artist to critic." Emma leaned forward, intrigued. "Do you still have them? Your paintings?" "A few. Most were sold years ago." He removed his glasses, polishing them absently, a gesture Emma had come to recognize as a sign of emotional discomfort. "The curator is particularly interested in that last piece I showed you, the man with his back turned." "Because it's powerful," Emma said simply. "Anyone would want to include it." Harrington replaced his glasses, his gaze fixing on some middle distance. "It feels like an intrusion. Those paintings belong to a different life, a different version of myself." Emma considered this. "Are you going to refuse?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to, but another part wonders if it's time to reconcile those two halves of my professional identity." He looked directly at Emma. "What would you do?" The question startled her. In their evolving dynamic, Harrington had always been the mentor, the guide. This role reversal, him seeking her perspective, felt significant. "I think," Emma said slowly, that the greatest art comes from embracing our whole selves, the parts we're proud of and the parts we've hidden away. She gestured toward her paintings lining the studio walls. That's what you saw in my work, isn't it? The willingness to stand at the edge and look honestly at everything, the good and the terrifying. Harrington was silent for a long moment. When did you become so wise? He asked finally, his voice gentle. I had a good teacher, Emma replied with a small smile. The moment hung between them, a recognition of how their relationship had evolved, how they had each given the other something essential. Harrington had offered Emma opportunity and validation. She had reminded him of the courage required to create honestly. I'll think about it, he promised, standing. Now show me what else you've been working on. As winter gradually yielded to early spring, Emma's body of work grew. What had begun as individual paintings coalesced into a cohesive series, 15 canvases that spoke to each other, creating a visual conversation about isolation, connection, and the courage to reach across the spaces between people. Harrington arranged for the show to open in early May. He handled all the details Emma had never had to consider before: framing, lighting, catalog design, press releases. He introduced her to gallery staff, to other artists he represented, to collectors who began visiting her studio. These interactions, once unimaginable, became part of Emma's new reality. But the most profound change wasn't external. It was the quiet confidence that began to take root inside her, not arrogance or certainty, but a growing trust in her own artistic voice. She still had moments of paralyzing doubt, still woke some nights convinced that the entire experience was a mistake that would soon be corrected. But increasingly, those moments were balanced by a deeper knowing. Her work mattered. It spoke truth, and that was enough. 2 weeks before the exhibition opening, Harrington invited Emma to dinner at his home, a converted loft in Printer's Row that she'd never visited before. The space was surprisingly modest for someone of his stature. Open plan, with walls covered in art, bookcases overflowing, and a small kitchen where he moved with unexpected ease, preparing pasta while Emma explored his collection. This is a Rothko study, she marveled, examining a small oil painting. And is that a Helen Frankenthaler? Good eye, Harrington confirmed, grating parmesan over their plates. Small works, acquired early in their careers before prices became astronomical. He brought the food to a table set near windows overlooking the city lights. The benefit of recognizing talent before the market catches on. Over dinner, they discussed final preparations for the show, guest lists, the sequencing of paintings, Emma's artist statement. It felt surreal to be talking about her own exhibition with such matter-of-factness, as if she'd always been destined for this moment. There's something else I wanted to discuss, Harrington said as they finished their meal. A delicate matter. Emma set down her wine glass, suddenly apprehensive. What is it? The retrospective at the Whitney. I've decided to participate, to allow them to show my paintings alongside my critical work. Relief flooded through Emma. That's wonderful. I think it's the right decision. Because of our conversation, he acknowledged. You helped me see that separating those aspects of my life has been limiting. He hesitated. But there's a complication. The curator wants me to write something about my transition from artist to critic, to explain why I stopped painting. Emma waited, sensing there was more to the story than he'd previously shared. Harrington rose, clearing their plates with deliberate movements. The truth is more complicated than I've admitted, even to myself. He brought coffee to the table, the domestic ritual seeming to steady him. I didn't stop painting purely out of fear or practicality. I stopped because of a relationship that ended badly, with another artist, someone whose talent I believed in completely. Emma listened, recognizing the weight of a long-held confession. Her name was Claire. We were both emerging artists, both ambitious. I thought we were supporting each other's work, but in reality, I was becoming increasingly dependent on her validation. His voice grew quieter. When she left, for Paris, for a better opportunity, I discovered I couldn't paint without her approval. It was as if my creative voice existed only in relation to hers. So you reinvented yourself as a critic, Emma surmised. Yes. I told myself it was a strategic pivot, but it was really a retreat from vulnerability. He met Emma's eyes. Until I saw your painting at that auction. Standing at the edge of everything, it reminded me of what I'd walked away from. Not just making art, but the courage to create without guarantee of approval. The revelation shifted something in Emma's understanding of their connection. Harrington had recognized in her work not just talent, but a quality he had lost in himself, a willingness to risk emotional exposure through art. "Have you told the Whitney curator this story?" she asked. "Not yet. I'm not sure I can. It feels too personal for a museum catalog." Emma considered this. "Maybe you don't need to explain in words. Maybe you could show it instead." Harrington looked at her quizzically. "What do you mean?" "Paint something new," Emma said simply. "Include a new work alongside your old ones. Let the visual contrast tell the story of your journey." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Harrington's expression shifted from surprise to thoughtful consideration. "I haven't touched a brush in 20 years, he said softly. "All the more reason," Emma replied. "You've helped me find my voice again. Maybe it's time to reclaim your own." The weeks before the exhibition opening were a whirlwind of activity. Final selections were made, frames were fitted, lighting was adjusted. Emma wrote and rewrote her artist statement, struggling to articulate in words what her paintings expressed visually. Harrington reviewed drafts, offering suggestions, but insisting the final version be entirely her own. "These are your paintings," he reminded her. "Only you can explain why they exist?" Meanwhile, a curious development unfolded in their relationship. Taking Emma's suggestion to heart, Harrington had set up a small painting space in his loft. Emma began visiting after studio hours, sitting quietly while he tentatively reacquainted himself with brushes and canvas. His movements were hesitant at first, almost apologetic, but gradually gained confidence. "It's terrible," he declared one evening, staring at his work in progress, an abstract composition in muted blues and grays. "It's honest," Emma countered, studying the painting with genuine interest. "That's never terrible." Their roles had subtly reversed. Emma now the one offering encouragement, Harrington the uncertain creator. This new dynamic deepened their connection, transforming it from mentor, protege, to something closer to true collaboration between equals. The night before the exhibition opening, Emma couldn't sleep. She paced her apartment, still the same cramped space, though now she had plans to move once the show concluded, alternating between exhilaration and terror. Tomorrow, strangers would stand before her paintings, judging them and, by extension, judging her. The vulnerability was almost unbearable. At dawn, she gave up on sleep and walked to the lake, watching the sun rise over the water. The world felt poised on some threshold, her old life behind her, something new and unknown ahead. Whatever happened at the opening, she had already crossed an invisible boundary. She had made honest work and allowed it to be seen. Nothing could take that away. The Harrington Gallery was transformed for the evening. Emma's paintings were displayed against freshly painted walls, each work perfectly lit to highlight its emotional resonance. The exhibition title, "The Space Between," was elegantly stenciled at the entrance, alongside Emma's artist statement and a brief curatorial note from Harrington. Emma arrived early, dressed in a simple black dress borrowed from a friend, her red hair loose around her shoulders. Seeing her work displayed this way, professionally, respectfully, as if it mattered, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Are you ready?" Harrington appeared beside her, formal in a charcoal suit that somehow made him look both distinguished and approachable. "No," Emma admitted with a nervous laugh. "But yes." He squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity. "Remember, the work speaks for itself. You've already done the hard part." The doors opened at 6, and people began arriving, gallery regulars, collectors, artists, critics. Emma stood near the entrance with Harrington, accepting introductions, answering questions, watching as strangers engaged with her paintings. The conversations blurred together, but certain moments stood out with crystal clarity. An elderly woman who stood before the edge of everything for a full 15 minutes, then sought out Emma to thank her. A young art student who asked detailed questions about her technique, a collector who purchased 2 paintings within the first hour. Midway through the evening, a hush fell over the crowd as a new arrival was announced. Marissa Chen, the Whitney curator who had been working with Harrington on his retrospective. She made her way directly to Emma, her handshake firm and professional. "These are remarkable," she said without preamble, gesturing toward the paintings. "James told me I needed to see your work in person." He was right. Emma stammered her thanks, overwhelmed by the curator's directness. "I'm particularly interested in your collaborative process," Chen continued. "James mentioned you've been instrumental in his return to painting." Emma glanced at Harrington, surprised. He hadn't told her he'd discussed their arrangement with the Whitney curator. "We've been learning from each other," Emma said carefully. Chen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's evident in the work. There's a dialogue happening here, between your paintings and the space, between isolation and connection." She handed Emma a business card. "I'd like to continue this conversation. Perhaps there's an opportunity to explore this relationship further in a museum context." As Chen moved away to speak with Harrington, Emma stood still, the business card cool between her fingers. A museum context. The words seemed to belong to someone else's life story, not her own. The evening continued in a dreamlike progression. More conversations, more sales, more moments of seeing her work through others' eyes. By closing time, red dots marked 11 of the 15 paintings. "Success by any measure," Harrington assured her as the last guests departed. Alone in the gallery after hours, Emma and Harrington walked the space together, experiencing the exhibition in silence. The paintings seemed different now, no longer just Emma's private expressions, but public statements, open to interpretation and response. "How does it feel?" Harrington asked finally. "To be seen this way?" Emma considered the question. "Terrifying," she admitted. "And also, right. Like I've been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale." Harrington nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I have something to show you," he said after a moment. "One last piece that wasn't ready for tonight's opening." He led Emma to his office and unveiled a canvas that had been covered with a cloth. His new painting, completed in secret over the past weeks. It was nothing like his earlier work, nothing like the technical virtuosity of his final piece from 20 years ago. Instead, it was raw, almost primitive, a painting of two figures standing at the edge of an unseen precipice, their backs to the viewer, but their hands linked between them. "It's for the Whitney show," he explained quietly. "The final piece in my retrospective, not an end, but a new beginning." Emma studied the painting, recognizing the courage it represented, not just the return to creating after decades of silence, but the willingness to begin again as a novice, to risk making imperfect work in pursuit of honest expression. "It's beautiful," she said simply. "Because of you," Harrington replied. "You reminded me why I began painting in the first place, not for acclaim or validation, but because there are truths that can only be spoken in color and form." Emma felt tears threatening again. Not from nervousness this time, but from a profound recognition of how far they had both traveled in these months. From a struggling artist donating her most honest work to charity, to a successful critic rediscovering his creative voice, their paths had converged in ways neither could have anticipated. "What happens now?" Emma asked. Harrington smiled, not the polished gallery owner's smile, but something more genuine, touched with the same vulnerability evident in his new painting. "Now," he said, "we keep creating. Not because we know what comes next, but because we've remembered how to stand at the edge of everything and jump." 3 months after her exhibition opening, Emma stood in her new studio, a light-filled space in a converted factory building, far larger than anything she'd ever imagined working in. Around her, canvases in various stages of completion lined the walls. Her work had evolved again, growing more confident while maintaining the emotional honesty that had first caught Harrington's attention. The exhibition had changed everything. All 15 paintings had sold, the last 4 in the weeks following opening night. Reviews had been overwhelmingly positive, with critics noting Emma's unflinching emotional clarity and masterful technique in service of genuine human connection. Galleries in New York and San Francisco had reached out about possible shows. The Whitney was considering including her work alongside Harrington's in his retrospective, exploring their artistic dialogue. But the most significant change wasn't external. It was the quiet certainty Emma now carried within herself. Not that every painting would succeed or that recognition would continue, but that her voice mattered. That creating honestly was its own reward, regardless of outcome. Harrington visited weekly, bringing coffee and conversation. He had fully embraced his return to painting, working on a new series that explored themes of absence and return. Their relationship had settled into a true collaboration, each supporting the other's creative journey, each learning from the other's perspective. On this particular morning, Emma was completing a new work, larger and more complex than anything in her exhibition. Inspired by the journey of the past year, it depicted a woman standing at an easel, painting a horizon line between storm and possibility. Behind her, barely visible in the background, was the silhouette of another figure, a witness, a guide, a fellow traveler. As Emma added final touches, she thought about the newspaper headline that had seemed so surreal all those months ago. Struggling artist donated painting to charity auction. Buyer was a famed critic who launched her career. The words that had once felt like someone else's story had become her own. Not an ending, but a beginning. A threshold crossed. Standing back to assess her work, Emma felt a profound sense of rightness. The painting wasn't perfect, no true creation ever could be, but it was honest. It spoke of transformation through connection, of healing through creative courage, of the spaces between people that could be bridged through art. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.